Hello, students. Welcome to Principles of Marketing, Marketing 3336. I'm Professor Ahern, and this is our discussion of Chapter 3 out of the Principles of Marketing, Kotler and Armstrong, 18th edition. The title of this chapter is Analyzing the Marketing Environment, and we're going to be talking today about the effect of the marketing environment on the strategies of the firm, as well as the macro and micro strategies. So to get started in things, let's start talking about what the marketing environment itself is. So the marketing environment includes the actors and forces outside marketing that affect marketing management's ability to build and maintain successful relationships with target customers. So let's break that down a second. Remember, we talked about target customers. So we've talked about in the last few classes how we want to segment our marketplace, choose the appropriate segment, and then target the customers within those segments that we would like to go after. So after we've done that and we've identified those target customers that we want to pursue to be able to sell our goods and services and market our products to those customers, we have to consider what we call the marketing environment. And these are the forces that are outside our control that we try to influence and try to build a strategy around to be able to maximize our capabilities as a firm. So let's talk more about what we call this marketing environment as a whole. When we think about the marketing environment, it can be broken into two facets, the micro environment and the macro. And I'm going to talk about each of these independently. So let's first focus on the micro environment. So the micro environment consists of actors close to the company that affect its ability to serve its customers. So these are the company itself, the suppliers, what we call the marketing intermediaries, the customer markets, the competitors, and the publics. This is what we call the micro environment, okay? Then we also have what we call the macro environment. This consists of larger societal forces. So this is the larger societal forces that affect the micro environment. These are things like demographics, economic, natural, technological, political, and cultural forces. Now, I understand that this is a lot of information broken into these two categories, so let's get into each of these individually and really discuss what we mean by the micro environment and the macro environment, and really understand how firms utilize this information and watch this information closely and try to adjust to it to be able to maximize their effectiveness. So let's get into the micro environment. This is a figure from our book that outlines the core elements of the macro environment. I'm sorry, the micro environment. You should be very familiar with this. These are the elements that marketing takes into consideration in what we call the micro environment. So you have the company itself, and these are all the actors within the company. This is a fairly self-explanatory element. So this is like the senior executive team, the marketing management team, the supply chain team, all the major internal facets of the organization that play into the structural strategies of the firm itself. They affect marketing. So all of those elements touch into marketing and affect the way we can execute as a marketing function so that we have our internal company-specific micro environment. We also have our suppliers. And those are the people upstream that supply our parts and all the elements that go into our products and services that we distribute downstream. So for example, if we are selling automobiles, we may get tires upstream from a supplier. We may get steel upstream from a supplier. So our suppliers give us the resources necessary to produce our products that we sell downstream. So that's what a supplier is. So in order to create value for the customers, marketing partners with other firms that deliver value in their network. These other firms are what we call upstream, and they are suppliers. Upstream meaning it feeds into you, and then downstream meaning it goes downward towards the customer. So this is an upstream element, and this is a supplier. Next, we talk about marketing intermediaries. I'm going to get into that in much more detail. But when we think about intermediaries, these are downstream from you. These are individuals that can help you to market or facilitate the marketing of your products and services to the customer. We could talk about things like market research firms, advertising agencies, things like that that help in the marketing function, but they're not actually part of the company itself. Then we have competitors, the competitive landscape. All the companies that compete against you affect the way we make decisions in marketing. We're going to talk some more about publics and what we mean by publics, but this has a lot of different elements to it. It could be, for example, consumer affair groups that help in policing consumer action committees, for example. It can be the government itself, could be publics. So we're going to talk about this publics in some more detail, and then ultimately we have our customers that help shape our decision making in this environment. So let me get into a few of these that are less obvious to us and talk about these in more detail. Let's talk about this element that we call marketing intermediaries, because that's definitely less obvious to many of us. So when we think about marketing intermediaries, again, we have our company, then we have the customer. In between our company and the customer, we may have what we call a marketing intermediary that helps us to be able to market our products or our services to the ultimate customer. The first we could have is what we call a reseller. So we produce our product, and then we want to resell our product or sell that product to the customer. So we might leverage major resellers. A couple giant players in the space of resellers, Walmart, Costco, are huge resellers. And they actually are become such big deal in resellers that they're extremely powerful. So any of you who've ever been to Arkansas and seen where the headquarters of Walmart is, almost every major company that supplies Walmart has headquarters or offices right around, physically located around Walmart, just to make sure that they can adequately service Walmart, so that Walmart is so powerful and they connect with so many customers that they resell downstream, and they are a powerful entity or powerful marketing intermediary called a reseller. This is also true with Costco as well. Now we go to the physical distribution firms. These are firms that help warehouse, store, distribute our products to the marketplace. Let's think about some firms like Federal Express, FedEx, very efficient distribution systems, privatized. We have UPS. We actually have our own Federal Postal Service that works in the United States from a physical distribution element. These firms don't only deliver the products, but they also manage warehouse. They'll manage inventory management for companies. So they'll hold your product and they'll tell you how much you need, when to replenish product, all of those kind of things. So that's what we call physical distribution firms. The next, we have marketing services agencies. I talked briefly about that, but remember, a lot of times inside companies, you don't have every marketing service that you need to be able to execute your marketing function. So many companies, big companies like pharmaceutical companies, we could take an example of a big pharmaceutical company, Pfizer out of New York, or another one, GlaxoSmithKline. Any of these big pharma companies, any of these giant consumer goods companies like Coca-Cola, anything, all these companies have marketing personnel that work for their companies, but they also use what we call marketing services agencies. So for example, they may contract with an advertising agency that helps them with their advertising spots and actually build their advertising plan. They may contract with a market research firm that helps them to run market research studies to be able to understand customer decision-making or monitor their environments. So that's what we call marketing services agencies. And then lastly, we have what we call financial intermediaries. These are banks, these are lending institutions, these are financial service companies. So these are companies that help you to make financial offerings behind your products. I'll give you an example of this. When an auto dealership is selling you a car, they will often offer you, instead of buying it cash, financial terms. So they'll say, would you like to finance it over 5 years, 7 years, 3 years, and they'll give you interest rates. So what they do is they partner with other entities, or they work with other entities to get those financial deals for you to be able to help you sell products. Major department stores offer credit cards that you can use specifically for their store. Gas stations offer credit cards that work through financial intermediaries. All of these are what we call marketing intermediaries that help in the sale of our product in what we call the microenvironment. Next to the microenvironment, when we think about customers, customers can be a very broad definition. There can be a lot of things that make up a customer. We can have what we call consumer markets. So these are individuals who actually use the end product. Remember, consume versus customer. Customer is anyone who buys our products. Consumer is the ultimate user of the product. So we have business markets. These are companies that buy from other companies that may use those products to be able to manufacture. Remember, we talked about these upstream suppliers. This is an example. When they sell downstream, this is an example to them of a business market. They're selling to another business. We have reseller markets. We just talked about that a little bit. Those are self-explanatory. We have government markets. We can sell, one of the biggest areas we sell to in the United States for many firms is the federal government. So companies have to set up contracting mechanisms to sell to our US federal government and our state governments and local governments in the United States. And they have to follow the policies and procedures in order to sell to those markets that oftentimes are very complex. And then ultimately what we also have is what we call international markets. And firms have specialized sales to international markets because they have to watch out for policies and differences in regulatory policies, taxation, tariffs, all those things that help them to monitor to sell to international markets. So this is what we are often call customers. And then lastly, we talked about publics is one that I want to highlight. When we say publics, I'll give you an example of this. There's a lot of different elements when we think about publics. I told you an example of citizen action groups, for example, ones that help police products or consumer policy goods and stuff like this. Like the Better Business Bureau is a good public. So they're ones that help to monitor the businesses follow practices and procedures. We have media publics. So the media itself tries to police firms and police the way they do business. Financial publics that monitor the finances that firms use and the financial regulatory elements. We have so these are all different publics that look out for the way in which firms manage their business and police that business to be able to make sure they're selling effectively and ethically to the marketplace. So we talked about the microenvironment. Now let's talk about the macroenvironment. The macroenvironment consists of larger societal forces that affect the microenvironment. And so this is on the outside of what we call the micro is the shield or what we call the macro environment. And this is the ultimate outside that bears down on everything. And when we think about the macro environment, many of these things are changing elements in the major environment that firms often cannot control, but it's very important for them to monitor what's going on because it will change the way in which they market and sell their products. And we're going to talk about some of these, particularly in the demographic side and the economic side, as well as cultural too. So when we think about these, we think about demographic, and that's things like age, gender, ethnic or racial compositions, international and non-international, so any descriptive variable of a population or entity. The economic is economic factors like affluence, the sector. So it could be low income, medium income, high income. It could be individuals with more access to cash versus non-cash access. We have our natural, which is natural resources. Availability of natural resources affect the production of products and goods. We have technological advancements that happen in the marketplace, political changes. Oftentimes politics affects regulatory practice or international access to information. And then ultimately cultural elements. How does culture change the way in which we sell products? So let's focus on this macro environment and talk about it a little bit. So on the ultimate outside macro environment, we have demographics, economic, natural, technological, political, and cultural. I just spoke about each of them a minute, but I want to delve into a few of them in more detail that have a lot of importance to us. So let's first start off with demographic. One of the demographics that has been hugely interesting, and we're actually going to do an interview today as part of this segment, where I'm going to interview an expert on this topic of generational marketing. In fact, it's one of the professors here in the United States that's one of the top experts on looking at generational factors in the workforce and in marketing, which is, I think we'll find very interesting. But generational marketing is important in grouping people or segmenting people by lifestyle or life stage instead of just age. We're going to talk about generational marketing. Many of you have heard about things like for example, the millennials act differently, or the great generation is different, things like this. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and learn more about that in some detail today, because that tends to be very important to many firms right now. It's a hot topic. So if we think about the demographic environment and we think about these generations, this is the definition of the generations. And so, if we look at many of you that are in the room or in our class, many of you are Generation Z, and some of you are millennials as well. And there may be even a few people here that are Gen Xers, but most of you will be Gen Z or millennial. But these are all of the living generations that we think of now. The newest generation coming up is what we call the Generation Alpha. We're going to focus today on the ones with the most marketing power, and we're going to talk a little bit about them, and that is ranging from the silent generation to the Gen Z, and not really focus on the Generation Alpha right now. But I want you to have a better understanding of this, what we call demographic profiling of individuals. So if we look at this, all of the population of the United States, for example, and we segment the United States into different populational elements, we see that by far the biggest populations out there are the boomers, the Gen Z, and the millennials, okay? So, and if we look at these, the boomers, the Gen Z, and the millennials, those are very large groups. The silent generation is pretty small, and Gen X is also fairly small. So as far as the total amount of the population, they comprise a significant part of who we try to market to as firms. Now, let me talk to you a little bit about what makes and why companies are interested in generational differences. I'd like to take, first of all, a look at the difference on what makes a generational perspective. So on one side, we have two very famous tech giants. On one side, we have Zuckerberg, and the other we have Gates. So if we think about Mark Zuckerberg and Gates, they both grew up in different generations. And the question is why would those generations make their insights different in the way they think about the world and in the way they act and the way they frame their decision-making as consumers? So let's get into that a little bit. Many people mistakenly think that the main reason that there's a difference between these individuals is what we call an age effect. Because one is like 25 years younger than the other, the differences in all their perspectives is simply due to age. Now, there's some truth to that. When a person is older, say in their 50s or 60s, and another person is 30 years old, they're definitely going to have differences in life stage and differences in age. But they're also going to have a very important element of a difference as well, and that's what we call a cohort effect. And that is the time period that they grew up in, the people they grew up in around, all those things around them that they were exposed to that shaped them as an individual as they got older. So we have what we call an age effect and a cohort effect. To try to untangle this age and cohort effect isn't so easy, but some researchers have actually done a really nice job to prove that it's not just an age effect, but it is a cohort effect that changes the way people think about things in the world. So one set of researchers that did this that I found really interesting was some researchers looked at people when they graduate from high school. Many people take a quick test called What's the Best Career for You? So it's a short test that's like 20 minutes long that diagnoses what's the best career for you. And about 10 states in the United States mandate students to take that in high school. And in fact, that same test has been going on for almost 40 years in many states in high school. So what some researchers did is they took individuals across the generations and they took their averages of their scores of what's important to them for each time when a person was 18 years old across a 40-year period. And what they found was if it was completely an age effect, what's important to an 18-year-old in 1970 would be the same as what's important to an 18-year-old in 2020. And what they found is that is absolutely not the case. So not only is there a difference in people's what they think about because they're 18 years old versus 50, there's also things about the way you think about society as a whole and the way you do things that's different because of what we call the cohort effect. So you have the age effect and you have the cohort effect. So let's talk about each of these, the age and cohort effect. The combination of the age plus the cohort is what makes this generational difference. So there's going to be elements of it that are age and elements that are cohort, but the combination of the two actually what makes the generational difference. So there's an individual called Carl Mannheim who has this Carl Mannheim social forces perspective that's one of the most popular perspectives in understanding generational differences. So what he says is that differences in the formative influence manifest because of what we call psychological and behavioral differences. So I'm going to give you some examples of these. So some of the things that you're exposed to throughout your lifetime that may shape the way you are as an individual are differences in the economy, differences in social elements, differences in cultural elements, for example. So let's give you some examples. The baby boomers. What are some of the things, the key things that happened to them that shaped their lives as they grew up in their young life? Well, a baby boomer was exposed to the civil rights movement, definitely shaped them in the United States. They were also exposed to a time of what we call post-war prosperity. So when they were children, this was just after World War II, and we started to see a big prosperity where families are actually a big middle class, and families were actually generally doing pretty well during that period. They also experienced what we call space travel, the very first man on the moon. So all the very first space exploration and some big technological jumps during that period. So these are all elements that shape somebody who's a baby boomer. There's a couple of the things that people find about baby boomers. They tend to be ambitious. They tend to live to work. So they really enjoy working. They're more optimistic, and they tend to be very loyal to companies and loyal to products. So this is just a few things in general that they found about baby boomers. Next, let's look into the Gen Xers. A few of the things in Gen Xers that are really interesting is that Gen Xers were what we call latchkey kids. So they were the first generation where both parents actually worked in the workforce because more women started to work in the workforce during that time. So what they found is the kids would come home after school and be by themselves, and it shaped the difference from them from the prior generation in the way these kids were raised, where a parent was always at home with them. The next is they actually experienced some major tragedies. They had what we call the 3 Mile Island accident, a big nuclear accident. They had nuclear power during that time and nuclear weapons and things like that that shaped their thought about energy, about the way safety of the governmental practices. They also were the first ones to experience what we call the microcomputer. So they were the first ones to actually start using computers. So these individuals tend to be independent. They tend to be skeptical of things because they're skeptical about what happened with the government. They work to live, and they tend to be very entrepreneurial as individuals. Then let's move to the Gen Y, millennials. Some of you may be millennials in the room. So they were the ones that had things like the first ones to be exposed to social media, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. All these different elements became part of what we call the experience of the growing millennial or the Gen Y. Millennials tended to be the most diverse set where diversity tried to increase or significantly increase during that period, with a greater population of Asian, Hispanic, and African American as a total of the population itself. So the white population shrunk during that period of new generations. So they're exposed to more and more diversity when they're growing up during the millennial phase. These are individuals who are shaped by the Twin Towers. So the tragedy of the Twin Towers, and it shaped much of their thought process of things. So a few things about these individuals in what we call the Gen Y is they tend to be tech savvy, team players, tend to like to work in teams. They tend to be a little more entitled, thinking that individuals owe them. But they tend to also like what call work-life balance. They want to play, but at the same time, they want to have success in their jobs. So these are just some examples of some of the groups with the biggest buying power out there. Those three groups tend to be the biggest ones that companies are targeting, and now they're starting to look at the Gen Zs as well. But let's talk about how, given those profiles and what we know about them, that could shape the way we market to each of these groups. And one of the interesting things is this is an example of how baby boomers, because of their accumulation of wealth and their age and the time, they've tended to acquire, even though they're a smaller percentage of the population, they have about 39% of the total dollars in the United States. Their net wealth is 34% of the total wealth. So if I'm a company, as a percentage of the population, these are small individuals, but there's a tremendous amount of opportunity with these individuals. So one of the things we would often do is look at not only what percentage of the population somebody matches to, but how much wealth that percentage of the population has, because this is particularly important, not so much for everyday routine goods, but for luxury products. So if I was selling, for example, Louis Vuitton or luxury products into the market, or Mercedes-Benz or affluence products like Rolex, I would ask myself, what groups would I target? Well, we can see that baby boomers play a significant role in purchasing power. So maybe these are individuals that we want to target as a segment and be able to market to with some of the facets that we talked about what makes them distinct. So a few thoughts about how we manage this overall marketing environment. We've talked a lot about the macro and the micro environment, and many firms have different perspectives on how to control this environment. Some consider it what we call uncontrollable. They just react and adapt to the forces out there. So they just let them happen and they're reactive to those forces. Other firms take a more aggressive stance and they're proactive. They actually try to shape some of these external forces in markets. So there's an extent to which we can be what we call reactive or proactive. And then there's elements that they believe are completely uncontrollable. They just let it all happen. So the uncontrollable, the proactive, and reactive. But one of the things that we know is some of the very most successful firms in the history of the world are ones that were more proactive in nature. So business history reveals a lot of cases in which firm strategy shaped the actual structure of the industry. Think iPhone, the way they structured the industries, the way it works. Think of Nintendo's Wii, how that shaped the way in which the game console worked, for example. Think of the Apple computer, for example. Think of Microsoft, the way that you interface with the computer, and how we even use things like PowerPoint that we're looking at today. So we're going to talk about one company that had a massive shifting change in the way the entire environment happened, and that's Ford's Model T. So let's take a second, and I want to talk about that. We're going to watch a short video as a group and then talk about that briefly. So let's watch this video on the Model T.
This episode of Real Engineering is brought to you by Skillshare, home to over 20,000 classes that could teach you a new life skill. The Ford Model T was not the first car, not even close. Depending on how you define what a car is, that honor was achieved 100 years before Henry Ford was even born in 1769, when French engineer Nicolas Joseph Cugnot created this steam-powered vehicle designed to travel off-rail. The honor for the first true automobile goes to Carl Benz, founder of Mercedes-Benz in 1885, with this single-piston two-stroke gasoline-powered vehicle. The art of the automobile was well under development before Henry Ford hit the scene. No, Ford did not invent the automobile. He invented something much more profound. He created modern society. That is a massive claim, but bear with me. His manufacturing techniques did not just revolutionize how we design and build everything, making complicated machinery like tractors and cars affordable for the masses. His manufacturing techniques radically changed the trajectories of billions of people's careers. At the turn of the 18th century, craft manufacturing was the status quo, defined by a highly skilled workforce. People wishing to pursue a career in automotive manufacturing entered their career and progressed through an apprenticeship, picking up a huge variety of skills, gradually learning the tricks of the trade and being masters of their craft. Many would go on to run their own machine shops. These were less employees and more contractors. In these days, a machine like an automobile was not built entirely in-house. Parts would come from smaller machine shops from all over the city. They used general purpose tools and machines to create the parts needed, which would be sent to the final assembler. These parts would vary massively from one batch to another, requiring a skilled assembling team. Workers needed to understand the function of the part they were working on and skillfully manipulate the parts together into the final vehicle. There was no mass manufacturing of complex machines like this. Each vehicle was one of a kind, commissioned by whoever was wealthy enough to afford it. At this production volume, no company could create a monopoly. There were hundreds of small craft shops like this across Western Europe and North America, but many would soon be run out of business by Henry Ford before they had the chance to adopt his mass manufacturing techniques. Only the best craft manufacturers survived. Companies like Aston Martin and Bentley succeeded by focusing on the ultra-wealthy that could afford these one-off vehicles, using skilled craftsmen to build unique and luxurious cars. But even they would soon have to join the movement to survive, all eventually being bought out by these mass production powerhouses, no longer able to keep up with the cost of innovation and manufacturing required to keep pace in the automotive industry. At the high point of the Model T's success in 1923, Ford was manufacturing 2.1 million Model Ts a year, a figure that would only be matched by a single vehicle model again with the VW Beetle. Many people chalk Henry Ford's success down to inflexibility in design. The famous quote, "You can have any color as long as it's black." This was true for many years, but perhaps not for the reasons you think. You see, Henry Ford was obsessed with manufacturing speeds. The painting process he used allowed the paint to dry quickly, and it was only available in black at that time. He shaved time off wherever possible to achieve that monumental milestone of 2.1 million Model Ts a year. The Model T was no fluke. It was the culmination in over 20 design iterations over 5 years, each one tweaking the design and manufacturing procedure to cut seconds off the total process. And the innovations continued through the nearly 20 years of production that would see a total of 15 million Model Ts manufactured. Ford worked all his life to learn the skills needed to achieve this goal, which you can learn more about.
So that's a little bit for you. If you'd like to look more into this, it's at this site. It's youtube.com/c/businesscasual. But I just wanted to bring up that, this is an example of a way a firm radically changed the marketplace by looking to shape the marketplace as a whole. So there are examples where this happens, but mainly firms are reactive to this. And I look forward to seeing you next session. Thank you.